On this Thursday night, urgent calls for countries to take steps to slow the spread of COVID-19. I speak with a Canadian doctor playing a key role and just returned from China.
The most critical thing here is speed.
Why he says worst-case scenario planning is essential, and the mystery of why some young adults die from the virus. Plus, the push to help workers forced to stay home. Dialing down the cost of cell phone plans, Ottawa's ultimatum to big telecom. Plus, a Quebec rail blockade removed for now.
Let this be a strong message and demonstration of good faith to all of Canada.
And the natural gas project in Canada in jeopardy.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with fast-moving developments in the coronavirus. There are now more than 97,000 cases of COVID-19 worldwide. And the Canadian doctor who is the assistant director of the World Health Organization says now is the time for countries to pull out all the stops.
We're seeing evidence that this can actually be contained and controlled, but we're not seeing that effort to contain and control it keep pace with the spread. So we're right at a tipping point where the commitment of governments and countries to really get on top of this is going to be crucial in the coming few days and weeks.
That's Dr. Bruce Aylward. He's just returned from studying the outbreak in China. I spoke with him today about what he learned there about the virus, how it spreads, and who it kills. That's coming up. First, though, the numbers. Canada now has 12 new cases. That includes the first presumptive case just announced in Alberta, a Calgary woman in her 50s who was on the Grand Princess cruise ship. We'll tell you more about that in a moment, too. If her test is confirmed, it means a total of 46 in Canada. BC has 8 new cases. Half are connected to previously identified cases and linked to travel to Iran. One, though, is a woman who hasn't traveled and had no known contact with anyone who did. It appears to be the first case of community transmission in Canada. The other cases are in Ontario, and 2 others are in Quebec. In the U.S., 18 states have now detected the virus. Most have just 1 or 2 cases, but in California and Washington state, there are clusters of illness. South Korea, Italy, and Iran are still the hardest hit. In China, where this outbreak began, new infections have slowed dramatically in the past 2 weeks. Around the world, there are nearly 98,000 confirmed cases and more than 3,300 deaths. The WHO says China appears to have suppressed the outbreak in Wuhan because it acted fast, and that can be replicated, it says, in other countries, including Canada. But worst-case scenario planning should be well underway. In tonight's top story, David Akin looks at whether Canada is heeding that advice.
Among the latest COVID-19 cases in Ontario, a man in Toronto just back from Iran, and a woman in Kitchener just back from Italy.
That's a new one for us. First from Italy. With what's going on in Italy, I would be expecting some more.
Some regions of Italy, along with China, Iran, and South Korea, are the world's COVID-19 hotspots. Canada is screening travelers arriving from those regions and taking action on a case-by-case basis. But other countries, the United States, Indonesia, and most notably Australia, have taken a much more restrictive approach. Australia now bans all foreign nationals arriving from South Korea, China, and Iran. And Australian citizens arriving from those countries face a mandatory 14-day quarantine, no matter their health condition. But Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada would stick with its case-by-case approach.
There is a lot of misinformation out there. There is a lot of knee-jerk reaction that isn't keeping people safe. The decisions we make are based on the best recommendations of the WHO and the tremendous health experts who work both in Canada and around the world.
Ontario's top public health official said Australia-style travel bans may not work for Canada.
Our experience is that they only work to a limited extent. As you can see, some countries had quite strong travel bans, like the U.S., like Italy, and it didn't prove to be successful at this time.
Travel bans can also increase the damage to the economy, and the day after the Bank of Canada slashed its key interest rate because of the economic impact of COVID-19, Bank Governor Stephen Poloz cautioned about the uncertainty ahead.
We believe we've done a lot there to cushion a blow. We don't know how big the blow might be, so we'll be looking at ways to figure out how big that blow might be and how long it might last.
That uncertainty weighed on investors. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by more than 3.5% Thursday, while Canada's benchmark S&P TSX Composite was down by more than 1.3%. Finally, Donna, it's important to mention that Canada's public health officials, like Dr. Williams, continue to say that Canada's containment system is working and the risk to public health remains low.
That is important. David Akin in Ottawa, thanks. More new cases have emerged in Europe, and in the UK, the first person has died. Authorities say an elderly person with underlying health conditions is the UK's first COVID-19 victim. 25 more people tested positive there, bringing the total in the UK to 115. The Prime Minister's official spokesperson warned today that it's highly likely the virus is going to spread in a significant way. In Greece, the number of cases jumped from 10 to 31. Authorities have shut down schools and universities and banned major public gatherings in parts of Greece for at least several days. Similar bans are already in place in Italy and Iran, where the healthcare systems are struggling to cope with thousands of infections. And passengers on board the Grand Princess cruise ship, owned by the same company as the Diamond Princess, are in limbo tonight. It's being held off the coast of San Francisco because a man who had been a passenger has since died of the virus. It's the same ship a Calgary woman was on. She's Alberta's first presumptive case. More than 20 people who are still on board are showing symptoms. As Abigail Bimman reports, among the thousands of passengers are 235 Canadians.
They are bleaching and wiping and going on and on.
A live stream from two sisters stuck on a cruise off the coast of San Francisco.
My heart rate was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I was like, everything was running through my head, and I didn't want to go home. I don't want to go home to my family because I don't want to take anything to them. Right. I don't want to take it to my city if I happen to have it on my clothes or whatever.
Half the passengers are from California. 235 Canadians are aboard too.
We are going to be flying testing kits to the cruise ship, and we are going to be sending those quickly back.
The first COVID-19 death in the state of California was traced back to a passenger who was aboard the same ship last month. The governor has issued a state of emergency joining Florida and Washington state. There, an old motel will be turned into a quarantine facility with at least 10 deaths and a new spike in the number of cases. And New York saw its number of cases double Thursday.
What ends up happening is that there's a friend of the person who's in the hospital, and then that person has a friend, and then they have family and relatives.
But in a Fox News interview Wednesday, the American president questioned the World Health Organization's official death rate.
I think the 3.4% is really a false number. Now, this is just my hunch, because a lot of people will have this, and it's very mild. Personally, I would say the number is way under 1%.
Medical experts expect the number of U.S. cases to climb further once more tests are done.
We don't have enough tests today to meet what we anticipate will be the demand going forward.
American officials previously promised 1 million tests would be available by the end of next week. Meanwhile, lawmakers here approved $8.3 billion in emergency spending to combat the outbreak. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Washington.
There's an upgraded travel warning from the Canadian government tonight. Canadians are now being told to avoid all travel to Iran. That country is dealing with one of the worst COVID-19 outbreaks outside China. People coming to Canada from Iran and from Hubei province in China are being asked to voluntarily self-isolate for 2 weeks when they get here. Mike Drolet explains how self-isolation and social distancing can help limit the spread.
It was jarring to see Canadians returning from Wuhan, China, quarantined at CFB Trenton. But while it may have stoked fears of an outbreak of COVID-19, none of those who lived in isolation for 14 days were infected by the virus. It was a precaution, similar to when Marilyn and Tom Shook returned to Saskatchewan from a February cruise in the East China Sea and were told they needed to self-isolate. So they did, voluntarily.
We weren't quarantined. It would be different if we had the disease. I don't know what they would have done if we would have told them, no, we're going to just go around waiver.
Health officials have 3 options here in Canada. Isolation for patients who are infected, but they can also ask people like the Shooks to self-isolate as a precaution. So it's a broad term. Quarantine, which restricts the movement of people who may have been exposed but are not yet sick. And social distancing, which prevents people from congregating in large crowds.
The public health infrastructure does have the power to do all sorts of things that normally you would not do to people.
We've seen social distancing in other countries. The Japanese Baseball League is playing its preseason games in empty stadiums, and there are discussions to postpone the season outright. And in the NBA, players have been told to refrain from high-fiving fans and no more autographs. But most pressing for Canadians right now is what happens if you need to stay home. Politicians in Ontario and Nova Scotia are pushing for temporary measures whereby employees would not have to get a doctor's note, as well as ways to offset the potential for lost income.
They've warned the current provincial labour laws are, quote, a serious threat to the health and safety of Ontarians.
The idea is to make self-isolation less burdensome, because nobody should have to feel like they're fighting this alone. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
In other news tonight, one of the last remaining rail blockades in this country has come down. Mohawks on the Ganawage Reserve in Quebec had been blocking the tracks for almost 4 weeks. After debate within the Ganawage community and discussions with Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in BC, the protesters removed the blockade this afternoon. Our Mike Armstrong was there.
The sacred fire that had burned for 28 days at the rail blockade in Ganawage has been moved. Early Thursday afternoon, it was relocated. As the procession crossed the highway, Mohawks explained they have removed the blockade to take pressure off the situation in BC.
The relocation is a gesture of good faith, as the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are now taking the time to deliberate on the proposed agreement.
The fire will continue to burn as a sign. It'll be visible on the side of the highway to thousands of cars that pass through the reserve, a message that the blockade can go up again.
We will be closely monitoring the situation in Wet'suwet'en, as well as other Indigenous communities.
Another blockade in eastern Quebec is still up. Micmacs and Listigouche have been blocking rails in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en for 25 days. They say they're in consultation, debating whether to remove it.
It is an opportunity to make the most of Western Canada's existing natural gas surpluses.
Now, the blockades over a pipeline in BC may kill a natural gas project in Quebec. The promoter behind a plan to build a $9.5 billion LNG terminal in Saguenay says its biggest backer is pulling out. The reports Warren Buffett is that backer through his investment company Berkshire Hathaway. The reason, according to the promoter, instability and challenges in the current Canadian political context. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Ganawage, Quebec.
The Manitoba government is changing course and will introduce its own carbon tax. It will be $25 per ton, and it will start on Canada Day. To help offset the cost, Premier Brian Pallister says he'll lower the provincial sales tax by 1 point to 6%. Ottawa has imposed a carbon tax of $20 a ton on Manitoba and 3 other provinces, and it will rise to $50 by 2022. Pallister is fighting that tax in court and says he's trying to protect people from the escalating pricing scheme. He says Manitoba's changes could save the average household $525 per year. There is an ugly fight over migrants on the border between Turkey and Greece. Turkey has deployed 1,000 police officers. Greek police are firing tear gas, stun grenades, and water cannon. They're trying to stop the migrants from crossing. Turkey claims Greek police have even fired live ammunition and have killed at least 4 migrants. Greece denies that. Huge numbers of people, including children, are trapped in this. They're outside. They're hoping to make the journey to Europe. Turkey is allowing the mass exodus from its country, saying it can no longer afford to support the millions of refugees who have fled the war in Syria. The International Criminal Court has ruled an investigation into alleged war crimes by Americans and others in Afghanistan can go ahead. The prosecutor says the court has enough information to prove U.S. forces had committed what it calls acts of torture, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, rape, and sexual violence in Afghanistan. This overturns a previous decision that blocked the investigation. The actions of the Taliban, the Afghan government, and American troops since May of 2003 are expected to be examined. Still ahead, Ottawa's call to big telecom: save customers money or else. A warning today to Canada's 3 big cell phone companies from the federal government. They have 2 years to slash their prices to customers by 25%, or the government says it will take action to increase competition. For years, Canadian cell phone prices have been among the highest in the world. Telecom companies are warning if they slash prices, they'll have to slash jobs, too. Mike LeCouture reports.
Nearly 9 in 10 Canadians own a cell phone. According to a recent government survey, 95% of those people say pricing on mobile plans are worse compared to other countries. And 83% of people don't think their plan has gotten cheaper in the last 3 years. Following through on a campaign promise, the federal government is stepping in.
We expect the big three to reduce their prices by 25% in the next 2 years.
The subscribers could save as much as $15 a month. The big telecom companies point out prices in this country have come down in recent months. However, stats show they remain among the highest in the world. And if telcos won't comply within 2 years, the minister is promising to flex some regulatory muscle.
We will look at additional regulatory measures like how we deploy future spectrum or mobile virtual network operators as a means to drive more competition, which will help lower prices.
To create more competition, 1/4 of the new 5G spectrum is being opened to smaller and regional companies. But the CEO of TELUS already warned that could mean cuts.
In the vicinity of $1 billion of reduced investment over the next 5 years. The reduced employment is in the zip code of 5,000 jobs.
Consumer advocates applaud the price decrease, but say Canada still has a long way to go.
Let's put some brakes on the runaway Canadian train of pricing, but it's not going to resemble the U.S. or European markets for quite some time.
While announcing the next step in the 5G network, the Liberal government isn't saying who's going to build it. International partners have warned Canada not to use Huawei because of security concerns. But both Minister Baines and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said no decision has been made yet. Mike LeCouture, Global News, Ottawa.
Critical lessons: a Canadian doctor returns from China. His diagnosis of the COVID-19 outbreak. Next. As we wait to see what happens next with the coronavirus, a Canadian doctor has a front row seat. Dr. Bruce Aylward is Assistant Director General with the World Health Organization. He and a team just spent 2 weeks in China studying how that country suppressed the COVID-19 outbreak, restricting it largely to the city of Wuhan and the surrounding province. It is now spreading faster outside China than inside that country. Dr. Aylward, thanks so much for joining us. This is such a fast-evolving situation. The numbers change by the hour. You're among a handful of people watching this more closely than anyone else in the world. What's your assessment of where we're at with this virus?
Well, we're at a pretty critical point right now because we're at a point where we're seeing a rapid international spread, as one would anticipate with a virus like this. We're seeing evidence that this can actually be contained and controlled, but we're not seeing that effort to contain and control it keep pace with the spread. So we're right at a tipping point where the commitment of governments and countries to really get on top of this is going to be crucial in the coming few days and weeks.
What is the most critical thing right now?
The most critical thing here, Donna, is speed. Test them quickly and then know whether or not they have to be isolated. So it spreads similar to the way of flu, but there are differences. And that provides us a little window to, if we move very fast in a country, to be able to find it quickly, contain the cases or isolate them, find their close contacts, and stop what we call transmission chains. And that can prevent an awful lot of damage.
What do we know specifically about the transmission of this virus?
There's some really important things we know, Donna. The most important is that the vast majority of the transmission is going to be driven by people who have the symptoms as well as their very close contacts. And most of it is going to be occurring in areas where you've got prolonged exposures in close proximity, in families, in a cubicle, maybe at work.
Dr. Aylward, who is most vulnerable? We know the elderly and people with underlying health issues are dying from it, but we've heard of cases where younger people get it and die too. What did you learn about that in China?
There's a lot of 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds who get this disease. They're very healthy and they die quickly sometimes. We don't know why these people are deteriorating. So it's a big, still unanswered question, and it's a really important one, because that would help us obviously tackle this.
And this is a key question for parents. What about children getting it?
It looks like children have in general, a more mild form of the disease. Now, they can, though, get sick and they can die, but at a much lower frequency.
Canada is ramping up preparations. What do you make of Canada's response?
It's impressive. After SARS, you built a public health care system that knows how to find cases, investigate them, follow their contacts, and manage them properly, because you're not seeing clusters of outbreaks around these cases.
Do you think it's too much or inappropriate for countries to do worst-case scenario planning?
You have to plan for worst-case scenarios, and you want to tell your population, here's what we're going to do if we have individual cases. Here's what we're going to do if we start having clusters. Here's what we're going to do if we have widespread community transmission, because you have to bring your population with you. They're the key.
Dr. Aylward from the World Health Organization, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Donna.
He's been working so hard for weeks. That is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Henderson Lake in Lethbridge, Alberta. We'd love to see Your Canada. Please email it to us. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.